Okay, we're back with part 8, chapter 6. Let's go ahead and do some questions. So I've assigned a bunch. I've tweeted them to you. It's questions 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, 13, 16, 21, and 23. We'll do about half of them now and the other half later on in the chapter. So we're going to start with question number 2, which is on page 192 of the book. Suppose that a person who is burned in an accident suffers intense pain for 1 week and then fully recovers. What does perfect compensation mean in principle as applied to the burn? Why do you expect actual compensation to be imperfect? Perfect compensation here would be how much money would you accept in exchange for 1 week of intense pain? And it would be to that person, because remember, someone who does it voluntarily, they're involved in the accident involuntarily. So how much would that person accept for 1 week of excruciating pain, and then you get over it? Why do you expect actual compensation to be imperfect? That's pretty easy. It's subjective. So the plaintiff obviously has every incentive to puff things up. But they're not going to be an independent judge in this case of what all of that might entail. Okay, let's go to question number 5. This is on page 198, but it's going to it references a diagram on the page before, one that I've actually drawn for you and shown. And so we want to change that diagram to represent a rule that motor vehicles must stay within a designated speed limit, say 90 kilometers per hour. Okay. Here is the diagram, and the only difference, this is obviously going to be 90 kilometers per hour. The only difference is we're not going to go from 0 and increase. We're going to go from 0 here and decrease. So if you're going more than, I said 0 and decrease, well, of course I didn't mean that. 0 and then increasing that way. So anything in the forbidden zone would be a speed in excess of 90 kilometers per hour. Anything in the permitted zone would be a speed limit below 90 kilometers per hour. So pretty simple. We just have to reverse the way we're measuring things. So we're measuring it right to left rather than left to right. Okay. Next up on the docket is question number 6. Okay. Offer an economic explanation, and this is on page 198. Offer an economic explanation for why the owner of a dog is liable for the harm it causes due to his negligence, whereas the owner of a tiger is strictly liable for any harm that it causes. And no, I have not seen Tiger King, but I know a lot of people have. So why do we have negligence with the dog and strict liability with the tiger? Well, it should be obvious to you. Tigers are inherently dangerous. You may have a dog with no history of violent tendencies, and you're guilty if you're negligent. You allow your dog to bite somebody. And then you could argue that, look, it's never happened before, the dog was spooked or whatever, and then you can see if the other side's comparatively negligent. With the tiger, they're innately wild animals, and therefore there's no expectation they're truly going to be under control at all times. Just ask Siegfried and Roy on that. Okay. All right, next one we have is question number 7 on page 199. Describe the 3 elements of a tort in the following situations. Remember the 3 elements: harm, causation, breach of a duty. Okay. So we start with A. Motorists driving on crossing streets come to an intersection with a stoplight and collide. Obviously, the harm is whoever gets hit. The cause is what car hits it. And the breach was either party not following the rules of the road. So it may be that you were at the stop first, you're going through the intersection, and the car to your right just zooms through the intersection and you hit it. but they are negligent in that they didn't follow the traffic signs. Okay. B, the owner of Al's Donut Shop spreads the false rumor that patrons of Betty's Donut Shop got ptomaine poisoning from the jelly in her donuts, so they got really sick from eating her jelly donuts. The harm here is a harm to someone's reputation. And that's certainly a tort, okay? You don't have to get hurt. You could be hurt financially in this case. The cause of that is what is the rumor spread by Al, and the duty is to not spread malicious rumors, okay? Don't start spreading things that you know are demonstrably false, and you will get sued as a result of that, possibly. Okay, finally, C, the escalator in a store rips a customer's pant leg to shreds. The damage to the pants, that's going to be the cause. The harm is the escalator, and the duty is to properly maintain the escalator and for the victim to also be using it appropriately and not to use the escalator in an inappropriate manner, okay? What could be a contributory negligence here? If the pants were really long and they dragged on the ground, so they represented a hazard and the individual didn't appropriately step when they got to the end of the escalator and then they get caught. I have actually worked on cases not involving pants, but involving minors, toddlers, who have been injured on faulty escalators. So something like that is actually real. Okay. Next up, let me get my list. My list is somewhere. Oh, turn the wrong spot. Okay. We now move to page 205, questions number 8 and 9. They're related to each other. Okay, so question 8, assume you park your car in a legal parking space on a corner, and a driver who comes around the corner too fast rams the bumper of his truck into your car, damaging your car but not his truck. A rule of no liability gives the driver of the truck the same incentives to avoid such accidents as the incentives given to you to park your car in a safe place under rule of strict liability with perfect compensation. Okay. I don't want to reread that, but I want you to carefully read 205 because the incentives here are none. So with no liability, the driver has no incentive to come around the curve in an appropriate manner, because if they hit a car that's parked, they're not going to be held liable. And if it is strict liability with perfect compensation, it's the same thing. You have no incentive to park your car in an appropriate manner because there's going to be strict liability. If anyone hits your car, then they are responsible for all the damages. The key thing to that question is perfect compensation, because perfect compensation, go back a little bit earlier in the chapter, is where the component that had A, which is the harm, and the component that had D, which is the damage award, exactly offset each other. Okay, and that was the case with strict liability, that all that's left is the precaution taken by the individual, and they minimize the cost by taking no precaution whatsoever. Same thing that's going on here. So either of these extreme legal rules would lead one party or the other party to take absolutely no precaution. Okay, now to question number 9. Given why the incentive problem in the previous question cannot be solved by a rule of strict liability with imperfect compensation. So explain why we might have mixed incentives in a situation like that. And say the actual compensation equals 50% of perfect compensation. So your car suffers $10,000 in damage, but you're only going to get a $5,000 award. In that case, the injurer doesn't have an incentive to take all accident avoiding precaution, since he or she will be liable for only half the damage, and the victim has no incentive to avoid all harm because they're going to be liable for half of the injury. So if we have a strict liability but imperfect compensation, then the potential risk to the driver, the truck driver, is not as great, and the potential harm to the person parking the car is greater than zero. The cost is greater than zero to them because they are going to bear some of the costs associated with the accident that takes place. Okay. So that gives us the first half of the questions for the chapter. Let's continue on with a couple more things, and then we'll continue all this in part 9. Many more parts to come, for sure. Okay, we have lots of different rules that we have been talking about, and so let's go ahead and talk about another one, and that is strict liability with contributory negligence. So strict liability here with contributory negligence is kind of, it's almost like an oxymoron, because strict liability means the one who caused the harm is guilty. But here, they completely are absolved of the guilt if there's contributory negligence. This is Butterfield all the way, okay? And the way we would show that, pretty simple. We don't even look and see what precaution was taken by the injurer. All we do is see what the victim did. The injurer is liable if the, that's right. The injurer is going to be liable if the victim took at least the efficient level of precaution. The victim will be totally liable. They're going to be on the hook and suffer for the damages that they incurred if the level of precaution they took is under the legal limit or the efficient level. Okay. So negligent consumers in a situation like that are going to lose. A lot of consumer products, and we're going to deal with this a little later in the chapter, a lot of consumer products, in fact, start from the premise of strict liability, but then if someone used the product in an inappropriate manner, then that's the way that the defendant will be absolved of any blame. So, for example, what if you get an electric shock from a hairdryer? Well, if you were using it in the bathtub, it might kill you. That would be negligence on the part of the victim, as kind of an obvious example. Okay, we will continue on the in part 9, and we're going to start with something that is very, very famous and very prescient and economically smart, coming a lot of years ago from a judge of all people. So we'll deal with that in part 9.